Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started. This is a program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Edward Rothstein. He's going to talk on democratic vistas and ideological constraints, the discontents in American culture. Edward Rothstein is the cultural critic, or the culture critic, at the Wall Street Journal. He was the same formerly at the New York Times. He's written for important publications like the New Republic, New York Review of Books, in addition to the two newspapers. He's a Yale graduate, and he got his PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He composes music, is that correct?
No.
No, that's not correct.
I listen to it.
He listens to music, and he's twice received the Deems Taylor Award for Music Criticism, and he's the author of Emblems of Mind, The Inner Life of Music and Mathematics, which explores the connection between music and physics, and he's right now teaching a course at the New School on music criticism. So, Edward Rothstein.
Thanks very much. I wasn't quite sure how to shape this talk because I didn't know. In a way, some of what I have to say will be obvious to people. I'm going to say it anyway, and then try to connect it with actually my professional experience over the last 5 to 10 years. But the way there was a news report about 15 years ago that really caught my attention. It still sort of stayed in my mind. It was that in a high-security prison in Florence, Colorado, there were 3 prisoners who were kept isolated in cages, but they'd be allowed to meet and talk, though isolated from each other, for several hours a day. And these prisoners were Timothy McVeigh, the bomber of the Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City, Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and Ramzi Ahmed Yosef was the mastermind behind the first World Trade Center bombing. And one of the prison officials is quoted in this news article saying it's the oddest coffee clutch in the history of Western civilization. And it really is. But what also really amazed me is that what subject did these 3 men talk about when they were allowed? I mean, they didn't have much time for conversation otherwise. They talked about movies. And this is just amazing because what you have is you have these 3 violent characters who actually sort of broke all moral constraints in very different ways. I mean, it would seem like they would have nothing whatsoever to do with each other. But the one thing that they all share is this love of movies, and they were constantly talking about whatever movie they had seen. This interests me because one of the things that they did share was that they all had in different ways a sort of disgust with Western civilization, with the ideas that are familiar from the Enlightenment. I mean, Timothy McVeigh had his perspective, and Yosef had his, but they were all, in a way, rebelling against, I guess, what we would call modernity, the world that surrounded them, of the same world, I should say, that they also were entranced with and talked about. And this contrast between being sort of entranced by the same world that you actually want to destroy, literally in these cases destroy, seems to get to be something that is not atypical of American culture, and about actually certain factors in the world as well, that there's this incredible lure of the same culture that is also incredibly repellent to the same people. And that this phenomenon, I don't know how often this has appeared in the past in other societies, where you have in a whole range of people, from the ordinary citizen to the terrorist. I mean, essentially the widest range possible. Signs of this sort of duality of both great interest and horror. So I mean, it really is on the basis of this sort of juxtaposition that I've been trying to think about this issue, and I wish I could say I figured it all out and I understand it, and maybe people here will have some suggestions, because I haven't really figured it out, except that I think that there is something about this phenomenon that has to do with the nature of the world that they're attracted to and repelled by, and that has something to do with democratic capitalist culture and the sort of facets of what we call modernity, but probably post-Enlightenment thought in the West. And that I don't know really of any comparable example in the past that has the same sort of doubleness, and to the very point where the use of vocabulary is adopted from the same source that is opposed, so that you have people like these three sort of terrorists talking about liberty and human rights and representation, and I mean, everybody talks as if they're rational political beings who have accepted the premises of this world, and they act in a completely different way. This goes on in different ways all the time. That is, I think that most conversations I hear about the United Nations, it seems like this is now the lingua franca of the world, that all of these descriptions of political behavior adopt the Western ideals, which really are unique in the history of world culture and have really come to maturity over the last 300-400 years, adopt it, accept it, and then mean something completely different when you start to look at the contexts under which these words are used or these ideas. So in trying to think about this phenomenon, one aspect of it, I've been wondering if there's something about the nature of democratic society that actually leads to something like this, not on this extreme level, but that we know that in a democratic culture, there is no, I mean, democracy is sort of interesting because it is non-utopian, unlike many political visions of the world. It is, and it doesn't promise that much, really. What it promises, you're going to get part of what you want, because you can't possibly get the whole, because there are just too many people's voices involved. There's too much debate. So the expectations are lower for democracy, I think, than other forms of government. Well, I'm overstating this a little bit, but the point is that argument and dissent are sort of built into democratic life, so that dissent actually becomes a sort of mainstream way of being a democratic citizen, and that if you aren't dissenting over one thing or another, you're not really exercising your play. You're not being a citizen. That this and this sense of being a constant sort of critic of one's own culture can in some cases lead to exaggeration, habits of where the question, you are judged more authentic if you act as a critic than as an advocate, generally, of your own society. This is also something that is remarkable in world history, I think. I don't know of cultures that have valued the criticism, or where a large number of people have valued the criticism of themselves to be the highest sort of virtue, and that this makes this self-criticism is treated as somehow more virtuous and enlightened than if you were to do the reverse. Something like this may be involved when you push it to the extreme case in these examples that I've mentioned. That is, again, that democracy is something that is non-utopian, that encourages dissent and argument and self-criticism because you are in the midst of these debates constantly. There may be other, and there are certainly other reasons for the prevalence of this. It could be shame, blame. In the midst of independent thinking, and self-criticism, there are all kinds of strange directions thought can take, and this could be just a manifestation of all of that. I'm not convinced by this, and I don't have a real solution of this issue, which actually I think is in a way very central, because I think American life right now is sort of built around these sort of expectations about dissent and advocacy. But there is an effect that this has on American culture as well. When Walt Whitman in 1871 was talking about democratic life, he said, "Oh well, the European literature was sort of had its birth in courts, and in the royal favors. While here in America, what we have is a great opportunity for a multitude of voices to be heard." From working men, from farmers, from people out in the West, men and women of the middle class and of the poor. I mean, Whitman sort of gave his sort of catalog of all of these new voices that would now be heard as part of the literature, and to a great extent, that is what's happened. But Whitman's view of this was that it would create something even more lofty than what had preceded it, that this monocular sort of hierarchical view that he saw coming out of Europe was now going to be democratized in this extraordinary way and create an openness and understanding of others that had not before been seen over the widest human area, was how he described it. Now, but these ideas are actually quite powerful, and in many ways have had great results. However, at the same time, in the midst of this sort of populism, which is sort of mass populism, there can be a tendency to say, oh, well, it's not just that we are hearing from all different people who are talking about their experiences. It's that we cannot privilege or give any precedence to one over the other, that in democracy, what you have are competing voices. Well, all of these voices are now so plentiful, and let them compete. Though it isn't quite put that way, because the competition is more that the demanding of the right to be heard as an equivalent speaker to somebody else, no matter what the conditions are or the background. So, in the midst of all this, the word elitist has come to seem like something that is a problem. I mean, you will have across the political spectrum people using the word elitist as if it were something to be shunned, because it somehow indicated a scorn of people, of ordinary people, of the people who make up this great mass that Whitman was talking about. And we recognize the effect of this, I think, quite a bit. Very often, the people who are most critical of elite visions of the arts are the same people who also consider themselves elite practitioners of the art. I mean, you have some of the same paradoxes that you have in the larger political scene. And the irony of all this is that the result ends up being strangely anti-democratic in ways I'll talk about. But I thought it might make it more concrete if I give an example of this kind of transformation, which I think has taken place from the world of museums, which I've spent probably 5 to 10 years pretty regularly paying attention to at the New York Times and now at the Journal, going to openings of major, mainly non-art museums history museums, etc., natural history museums. And it's caused me to think quite a bit about the evolution of the museum as an institution and what it represents now and what it has represented in the past. And again, I'll speak in sort of broad generalities, but I think if you go to Vienna or Paris or London, and you see the grand central museums of these cities, these are very often grow out of either a king's collection, or a national sort of collection based on sort of economic or imperial power, collecting objects from all over the world, and that the museum becomes a representative of this ambition. I mean, they are, in a sense, imperial museums, but also, I think, enlightened museums, because their idea is that our ambition in collecting these objects is not to show our power over the cultures that have produced them, but to gain some sort of understanding from them of people who are quite different from us and how they look at things. Now, of course, there was an element of superiority that came into play, or a sense of superiority. I mean, one of the interesting things is that in natural history museums, it was quite typical that along with objects related to the evolution of the natural world, the changes, geographic, evolutionary, in terms of species development, even the sort of physical aspects of environments, that you generally had in classic natural history museums also collections of non-Western art and materials, like Indian artifacts, American Indian artifacts, which are, I think there probably is no natural history museum older than 50 years that doesn't have a collection of these objects. And my sense of this is that it was, at the time when these institutions were built, it was part of the oppositional view would say that this indicates a sort of colonial vision of the natives who are too primitive and unable to understand things the way we Westerners can. But I think there's something very profound about what is actually being said, because what is being said is it comes right out of the Romantic tradition, that these people are somehow closer to nature. That is, when we're talking about these other cultures, that they're not in the Western tradition, and in some way they are envied. In some ways, they are envied for having somehow bypassed it or somehow survived through it. I mean, there really is this doubleness of both looking down upon them and also sort of desiring some aspect in the Romantic tradition, some aspect of this natural character. So we have these very big institutions that are meant to represent something to the surrounding society. They're established to, you could say, power, prestige, vision, and they were built to represent such things. I mean, the buildings of the great old museums are really, in a sense, sort of temple-like, and they really do seem to have almost a mythological standing. That is, there's mythology in the way of saying, look, here's where we came from, or this is our source. These are the ways we examine the world. This is how we account for where we are now. And I think this is true of art museums as well. But I think history museums and natural history museums particularly reflect this view. I think something happened. In the United States, there are quite a few museums that were built on this European model. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, for example, which is as extraordinary a sort of temple-like structure to the heritage of art of all kinds that you could imagine. I mean, it really is an amazing statement of the ideal, some sort of ideal of Western civilization, that is being able to not just encompass something universal, but be able to try to understand its languages and its artistic forms. So there was a way in which America sort of took on some of these aspects of the European model. But then there were also, I think, figures like Huntington and Morgan and others who created, at the turn of the 20th century, really, museums that were not meant to be as universal, but they were also personal. They were their collections. They didn't necessarily have a universal scope. They were meant to reflect their experience or interests. And the result are institutions that are extraordinary as well, that have nothing like them has been created since. But the thing is about these museums, I like the Huntington, the museum at the Huntington Gardens or the Morgan Library in New York. I think of them as sort of aspirational museums. That is, they're sort of American versions. Yeah, there were a lot of European collectors, but there was something here that, if you read the letters and writings of these people who established these collections, they thought of themselves as engaged in some sort of pedagogical, demonstrative project, that this was not just an expression of their own interests, or it was something that they thought would put America and its citizens on a different plane, or it provided something that should be aspired to, in their view. And you can't help but feel this if you go to these places and you see the foundation of what are now like really extraordinary collections. But at the time, these wealthy sort of figures who created these institutions really either knew what they were doing themselves or had people around them who really knew what they were doing. And this ideal of aspiration and expectation was really built into the entire project. There's a lot I could say that happened in between, but I think that right now, in the last 20 years particularly, a new genre of museum has come into existence that really doesn't have any clear parallel to the past, but that is as typical of our age and culture as the Imperial Museum was to its culture. And I've been thinking of this as an identity museum. These are museums that are constructed entirely in order to examine particular, and let's just take the American example, American group identities. So these are hyphenated. The subjects of these examinations are sort of hyphenated. There's the American Asian Museum. There's Arab American Museum. There are Jewish American museums. There are one of the more unusual and eccentric ones of these I've seen. There was a Nordic Heritage Museum in Seattle, because Seattle and the Northwest was settled by Scandinavian loggers and people who found in the Northwest climates that were similar to those in their region. And you had sort of Norwegians and Swedes and Finnish, and Seattle has this foundation of these various national groups, and they've gotten together and created the Nordic Heritage Museum, which is really quite unusual. But these museums have not just come into being, I think, all in the last 20 years, but there are more of them being planned. I mean, probably the most extravagant one was the American Indian Museum in Washington, National Museum of the American Indian. There's discussion now about a National Hispanic American Museum, and discussion about a women's history museum, a women's American history museum, also on the mall or near the mall, and having a sort of national stature. And this phenomenon is really quite unusual, I think, because instead of having a museum whose basic foundation is the Enlightenment and the universal perspective, you have a museum whose main point is to say, you know, here we are. And what I noticed after a while is that it's not surprising really, but all of these museums essentially tell the same story. The form of the story is exactly the same. In the American version, it's we came here, we were scorned, we were deprived, and mistreated, and it took a century before we realized that the source of our strength is actually to become more conscious of our own identity and take our guidance from it, and that this sort of transition, which took place in the 60s and 70s generally, led to our recognition of what our rights as a group entailed here in the United States. And since then, there's this tale of triumph, but with plenty of modifications, qualifications, because this long road toward equality, that is, towards some idea of the democratic ideal, is not being fulfilled. And it's interesting that museums are coming into existence whose sole purpose really is you don't even need artifacts in many of these museums. What you just need are the stories and some key tales. And just as the Enlightenment Museum had a sort of mythological purpose in the sense that it said where we come from, these museums do as well, and say to the current generation of these hyphenated Americans, I think of hyphenated Americans meaning dual sort of perspectives, like the ones I've been describing, and even Americans who are somehow not hyphenated. I don't know if any actually exist, but these museums say, here is our mythology. Here are our origins. Here are the things that are important to us. This can lead to very strange things. I mean, I think I've written about this a bit, but probably the worst museum to open in the last half century is the American Indian Museum in Washington. The Smithsonian had an extraordinary collection of Indian artifacts going back hundreds of years, collected in the 19th century by one or two figures. And I should say, as far as the documentation is concerned, 95% of these are not, like, it's not plunder. It was purchase and trade. That is part of the normal economic activity of the time, both in tribes and among people who went around saying, oh, I really like that. Can we make a trade for it? Anyway, you had in the Smithsonian American History Museum curators who were extremely knowledgeable about all aspects of these objects, their origins, the differences between the tribes they came from. And the first thing that the American History Museum did when it was establishing itself was to say, we are interested in something else. We want our tribes to tell their own story. This is their story, and they're going to tell it in their way. As a result, you had this incredible collection was sort of essentially taken apart, and even labels were taken off things, so the objects weren't identified. What you had were displays that might range over 1,000 years of American Indian artifacts that showed stars, or showed plants growing out of the ground. It was like somebody took a coloring book and decided to say, okay, we're going to really make this into something everybody can appreciate, not something that's, somehow esoteric. And the tribal exhibits that were created, and I'm talking now, these are exhibits that I saw 2005, 2006, were exhibits that really were created by the tribes, And they had historical sort of descriptions like 2,000 years ago, our forefathers learned to talk to the birds. Or 500 years ago, the god XYZ gave us the gift of whatever it is. Now, it sort of takes the ideal of mythology to a whole, in museums, to a whole old level. That this really, but you go through these exhibits, and what happened was the tribes consultants were brought in, professional museum consultants were brought in to help the tribes present their narratives. And what's astonishing is how uniform all of those are. You had tribes that were completely different. A group of Eskimos in Alaska, and a group of Amazonian forest dwellers in Brazil. Somehow everybody ends up loving peace and harmony, and they're all in tuned with. I'm really not making this up. It was unbelievable. I was sort of shocked by the anti-historical perspective that was being presented, and this sort of taking really it's a Western ideal from taking it right out of Romanticism and saying, okay, this is it. We really are the noble savages. We're noble, and the only thing different is that we weren't really savages. The rest of them were, but not us, because we loved peace, and we... this is now changing, but it took 10 years before anything was recognized as a problem. But the problem is, this is an extreme example, but it was a $170 million museum built like right next, pretty close to the U.S. Capitol. So I think if you stand on the Capitol, it is deliberately the first museum that you see on the left if you look out on the mall. And when the museum opened, this was made into a point about how this was sort of the rebuttal by the American Indians over what was done to them over the centuries, and that the U.S. Capitol can't overlook what's there. But this is the pattern of this view of history, the sort of stripping away of particulars, the embrace of sort of the group narrative over any kind of sense of individual accomplishment or differences or things that might be unpleasant or not fit one's current ideals, sort of filtered away. This is actually true in every single one of these museums I've been to. Even there's a small museum in Seattle that opened a few years ago. I think it's called the Wing Luk Asian American Museum. It tells the history of Asian immigrations to the United States, following the narrative that I outlined, except that in this case, what you have is Vietnamese, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Pacific Islanders, Hawaiian. You have everything sort of east of California, east of California, up until the sort of middle of the next hemisphere, is treated as Asian, and they all suffered in the same way coming here, so that you could almost just switch the nationalities around, and you'd have exactly the same exhibit told from many different standpoints. No indication that there might be a way in which the Chinese and Japanese wouldn't necessarily want to be associated with each other in this way, or almost any other group. That the whole idea was to filter away anything that distracted from the idea of the group identity, and the group identity is made as large as possible to incorporate as many groups as possible, in order to assert a certain kind of political clout or presence. This is even true, though it might seem strange, in the Nordic Heritage Museum I mentioned, because there's a Nordic Heritage Day. I think the museum was quite active in supporting in Seattle, where you have essentially a parade of the different nationalities coming through town celebrating their identity, their shared identity. Well, the wars between Norway and Sweden, or I think the day on which the parade takes place is the Independence Day of one of these nations from the other. But that, I won't bother looking it up now to be specific. The idea is the same. Another example. I mean, this is why it's actually going to be very interesting. The most major example of this may end up being the African American Museum that's going to open in 2016. I mean, indications are that it's going to be a lot more responsible. That is, curatorially, historically, but the identity this current is so strong that I wonder if it does avoid this sort of form, it will be pioneering in a sense. Now, what I'm saying about these identity museums, which are sort of take this idea of democracy and push it to an extreme as far as group identity is concerned, it's become, in a sense, anti-enlightenment. That is, the particular becomes indicative only of itself, not of something else. That you have to be identified and associated with that particular in order to understand anything else. And that this sort of grid is sort of put over everything. I think it's not a matter of let's come to understand our past, but let's sort of put our past forward in order to make certain demands or to show or to demonstrate something. That the museum is no longer, and there's something about the character of this museum is different. Museums are not there to present a collection of objects. As I was saying with the American Indian Museum, you could see that very clearly. The ideal is to somehow create an experience out of these objects, and this experience was going to somehow echo the experience of the group being portrayed. And I say anti-enlightenment because I don't think the ambition of using reason or historical examination in order to generalize or to see what is common or and thus also what is different, it's just not there at all. And that there is something I think in the narrative that I've described, there's also hints of what I started out talking about, which is really, okay, the democratic idea is great, but the United States has been really not a very good example of it. And actually, the history of our group's triumph is really a history of showing the failures, the succeeding failures of the democratic ideal as it's been put into practice. So there are very few of these exhibits or museums, maybe none, that, well, there is one exception, I'll get to that, that have very much positive to say about the hyphenated American experience. Yet, if you look at these exhibits, let's say you have and nearly every group was indeed treated horribly at various times in their history. There was one exhibit I saw in New York about the history of Chinese immigration that talked about all of the hardships that were faced, the immigration laws, the anti-Chinese laws, riots, etc., across the country. What it doesn't explain is that by the 1890s or 19-teens, this was all very well known, and yet you still have an enormous number of Chinese wanting to come and wanting to immigrate to the United States. Why? How could this possibly be? Well, the only possible explanation, aside from people wanting to get together with their families, is that things were so much worse in China at the time, which turns out to be the case, that you had conditions that were so awful that people were willing to go through life-threatening dangers in travel, and reports of riots and hatred here to say, no, it's going to be better for me there. And this choice is made again and again. So there's no necessity for this narrative to be shaped the way it is. And at the very least, there could be more nuance in it. One does not have to, but instead, one has the strong sentiment that not only the identity survives because of what we have done, but that we have succeeded despite what exists around us. This seems to me related in some way to what I started to think about, but I don't want to push the analogy too hard. But what we have is a real transformation in how, in these institutions, various aspects of the democratic ideal become sort of transformed into something quite different, and some of it is quite negative. It's also incredibly boring because it's now I now know exactly what to expect. I'm surprised when I don't find this, and there are very few times I haven't. I mean, one of the things, I went to an exhibit at the American Indian Museum a few months ago, and I was surprised that it didn't really follow this model, except, well, you did have the romance of the native sort of coming into play. Anyway, I'll stop now. And I'm interested actually in ideas that you may have on the subject.
Well, thanks very much. Yes.
Forgive me for asking a couple of softballs, but...
Did anybody ever need to apologize for a softball?
Well, yes, me to the other people in this group who want more hardballs, who know that hardballs are more productive of good discussion and good democracy. But your fascinating talk made me wonder about two things that you might add to your excellent discussion. Is there any group in America, I have often wondered this myself, is there any group in America that doesn't celebrate its own history of victimhood? And secondly, since you began by talking about individual terrorists, I thought it would help to bring in group terrorists, because I think we all know about the work of the Taliban in Bamiyan, is it Bamiyan, in Afghanistan, and the work of ISIS recently in Palmyra to destroy objects that would otherwise end up in museums of the earlier form of museums you talked about in the 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's also, I mean, in addition, there are things like the fact that Bin Laden, one of Bin Laden's favorite things was to watch American Western movies. Westerns, cowboy pictures.
He would have fit it right in Colorado.
And the Taliban, I think when they started to take power in Afghanistan, if I'm remembering right, they actually hung televisions from trees as if by nooses. That is symbolically saying, you know, we're against this culture is what we're opposed to. And yet,
Boko Haram's title is Western Education is Forbidden. Yeah.
So, but in answer to your first one, there is something I actually thought I was going to talk about, but it didn't come up because it's actually pretty complicated in itself. And I haven't really made sense of this yet, but the one exception really that I keep thinking about is the American Jewish Museum. And it's strange, but the narrative is completely different. And there is a National Museum of American Jewish History that opened in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and it sort of set the pattern which other museums, American Jewish museums, have followed. That is, you definitely have the accounts of victimhood, etc., but the triumph did not occur despite America, but because of America. And the contrast is incredible. So what you have are Jewish ritual objects from the turn of the 20th century that emulate and imitate American icons in order to stress the connection between their arrival and the possibility of liberty. Now, you could say, okay, well, the Jews have been a very successful ethnic group over the 20th century, so of course they would be celebrating the fact that they did triumph in this way. However, the overall approach is so different. There's got to be a lot more to this than I'm saying right now, and I think it almost needs a separate examination, because sociologically, there's another aspect of this. Aside from changing this narrative, there's another kind of attitude that comes up in almost every museum, American Jewish museum I've seen here, which is that, and this is that Judaism became strongest in the United States when it most assimilated to American ideals and most left behind its Judaic particularity. Overstating it slightly, but what you have is a sort of, in addition to honoring the sort of triumph in the United States, you have a sense that a contrast, the idea that what we have succeeded in doing is partly by putting aside the old world with its limitations and rules and found this sort of new covenant here in the United States. I mean, it really is, it's because a lot of American Jewish museums are actually founded by essentially secular American Jews, then they're sort of telling their own story and that of their community. So anyway, the American Jews, it's just a very different pattern.
Is there a white males museum?
You know, there isn't.
No.
Though there is this academic field now of studying whiteness.
Oh, so that victimhood is coming to pass. Yeah. Okay.
Let me theorize on that for a moment. The other groups you mentioned, when you talk about the ethnic groups, the Norwegians, come from a country of Norwegians. They may have had problems, but they didn't have problems there because they were Norwegians. A number of people have written books nowadays about become a nation of victims. Everybody's sort of claiming a victim identity. The Jews were different. The Jews were always an ethnic minority. And so whatever country they were in, they were the targets of the discrimination, not dissimilar to the claims being made in the United States by the groups who now trace their history of problems. They came here, and of course it was, to use perhaps for metaphor, a godsend, and the Jewish community thrived here. So their the description of their history is different from what other groups. Chinese, same thing. They came from China. Conditions may have been awful in China, but they weren't awful because they were Chinese. Everybody was Chinese. So they come here. Now you have what's supposed to be the great melting pot, but you have the hyphenated Americans, and everybody wants to grab onto what has become, I think, an excess of political concentration where you can get favors if you can prove that you were discriminated enough. The obvious examples here are favored groups, favored in terms of government legislation, blacks and women, and I think other people are lining up. The homosexual community has been trying it. Other groups would like to line up and sort of get their opportunity to get a slice of the pie. That said, I'd like to ask a question, and that is, among the groups of the most virulent and hostile criticism of America is the academic community. And I would be interested in your view as to why that's not a particular ethnic group, that's one you join by your elite and intellectual prowess. Why is the hostility to America so pointed and so acute in the academic world?
Well, this is actually, in a way, I think you'd be more qualified to answer this, I'm like an anthropologist on the outside, but You're on the inside, so you must have some.
No, he's
Oh,
he's a talk
excuse
show.
me.
He's a
Oh,
talk
excuse
show.
me.
But you're right between two
Very famous academics who could answer this question.
You want to?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I think this, I mean, when you were talking, to go back to the beginning about the oppositional critical mode and where it comes from, I think you can trace it to religion. The examination of your inner life and its qualities is obviously a religious model, which is secularized effectively. And in some ways, the academy is the successor to the church in its position in Western life, I would say.
So essentially, self-blame becomes like confession or
Yes, on
something.
behalf of the rest of the society, which is how the prayers of the monks worked in 13th century France. There is something in this about quality and quantity. That Whitman is hoping that the sheer quantity of American life will produce quality, but of course it's very difficult to produce excellence, and excellence in the arts, which is one of the things I think you're talking about here. Excellence in the arts, which is in some way a successor to perfection, in medieval religion, has never been democratic. One of the great fictions, which is you'll be familiar with it, which is still taught, is that Romanticism was a democratic movement. For the vast majority of the major figures in it, and for the majority of the time that we think of as romantic, they were anti-democratic. They were literally the elitists of their day. And another great fiction, which is perhaps even more deeply rooted now, is that modernism was a democratic movement. When the vast majority, and certainly the people we list as the best modernists, were all of them quite literally not just deeply anti-democratic, but deeply authoritarian. So I think this is, you'll probably know more about than I would, but I think this is a very long-running trend that is frequently misinterpreted, that actually the story of great art is an anti-democratic one. Mm-hmm. And that therefore it is ideologically highly unlikely to, if we leave art to the marketplace, then you're not going to get great art. What you will get is consensus and art which is aimed at bringing in the numbers.
Well, I think Tocqueville said that the crafts in a democracy would be imperfect. Mm-hmm. Well,
Mediocre.
Okay.
Yeah.
The object would not be perfection or high achievement. The object would be, imperfect satisfaction or something like that, right?
Right. Satisficing. That's a political science term.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There seems to be a kind of paradox or tension in the understanding of these people who put together these museums, which is that on the one hand they have a very, particularist understanding of the truth, which, as you said, they think that you can only access the truth through the lens of these particular experiences of particular groups. But on the other hand, they have this much more universalist allegiance to certain ideals of tolerance and peace and brotherhood and nature. So I wonder, and in fact, in some cases, as you say, they're willing to run roughshod over the actual particulars of their culture, which I think a respect for diversity would demand. You'd have to respect those, but they run roughshod over those, as you say, because of this allegiance to this more general narrative, this universalist narrative of peace and brotherhood and nature and tolerance.
Except that they mean something different. Really, if you look closely, they mean something different by it, I think. The most extreme thing would be to see, I don't know, the head of Hamas talking about human rights, something like that, violations of human rights, or, that the whole idea is that this vocabulary is used, but it doesn't have the same meaning, but somehow the desire is to take the prestige or the popular understanding of these and use its authority in some way to further one's ends. I mean, look, there is something totally legitimate about actually saying there were imperfect, that justice is imperfect, that our experience was unjust, and that it took time before such and such happened. That is, but so that it is not it's not necessary to say that narrative isn't true, but what's necessary to say is that that narrative is only part of this truth, and that by just restricting it to that, you're also changing what the idea of democracy or liberty, or that this is not a group right as a group, that this is not the way these ideas were conceived.
I guess my question would be, is it possible that in the minds of some or many of these people, actually the allegiance to the universal ideals is actually stronger in them? It sounds like you're saying, no, actually what they care most about is their particular culture, and they're going to use these ideals to further those ends. But is it possible that for many of them it's the reverse? They actually do care, when push comes to shove, they care more deeply about tolerance and equality, peace and brotherhood.
Yeah, I mean, then yes, it would mean that some of the people are quite sincere about this, and maybe even most. But the problem is that this way of approaching things is being taught and encouraged from elementary school. My kids had these sorts of views encouraged in projects that they had to bring into class. That this is now such a dominant way of looking at the world that you can be very idealistic and noble, and the results can be completely different.
Yes.
I wanted to push you a little bit on the connection between the two elements of your talk, because I'll suggest something half-baked, and maybe you can respond. You started off talking about these three terrorists who have both an attractive and repulsive relationship with the culture at large. And then, in the larger part of your talk, you talked about the museums as a symbol of this, the rise of group identity. So my half-baked suggestion is that, you've observed that there's the use of this language of rights and so on, and that it carries very different meanings. I want to suggest that maybe the common ground between the three terrorists in the museums is that underneath the surface of this rights talk, we really have a sort of dialectic of honor and humiliation. In the case of terrorism, which is the particular form of war that our late democracy seems to have called into existence, it struck me that there is a classical example of this. And I'm thinking of Sophocles' Ajax. Ajax is this character that it reads like a school shooting. Right? Ajax goes mad. He hates everyone. He wants to kill them all, which is one of the characteristics of terrorism. You can't possibly kill everyone, and when you do kill everyone, there's no one left to honor you, and the thing ends in suicide, which is exactly the trajectory of at least the school shootings. And you have the same repulsion and attraction. One needs the honor. The anger comes from the dishonor or the humiliation. That one can never succeed in actually achieving, at least through terrorism. In Sophocles' telling, Ajax's problem is that Ulysses has convinced people to rob him of his honors. And one of the readings is, well, this is the transition from the old virtue of Athens to the new virtue that has become democratic. And under the democracy, we have the rule of charisma, as opposed to the rule of valor or something else. So one hates not the charismatic speaker, but the circumstances in which charisma is what causes honor to happen. So my half-baked thought is that is not the common ground of these three terrorists and the museums and the undercurrent of humiliation and honor, some sort of attempt to rebel against the particular rule of charisma that is in a high school called coolness, and in the media called celebrity, and in the academy called, I don't know, victimhood. This last bit was the most half-baked, but I just wanted to.
I have just a quarter-baked response that I think the idea that you have, one of the things that's also shared is this sort of psychological sense of grievance, that it may not even have to be as subtle as some idea of charismatic power, but just the idea that you're not getting what you should have. I mean, but the only thing is that why is that grievance felt in this particular way in the West, and in particular in America? In these ways, in the ways of sort of embrace and disgust, or determination to obliterate. I mean, that's the extreme. Let's say not even that. Let's say there's a sort of in the most gentle way, it's a matter of like adopting really the profession of continual self-criticism, dissociating oneself from the ideals that the Enlightenment sort of put forward, but deliberately in the name of justice, or it could be in the name of restitution, of feeling that some grievance is going to be taken care of. I don't know.
Yes, Rory.
I want to go back to the point that was just raised about the 3 fellows in the jail. It seems that your descriptions of these museums and of the victimhood narrative, a lot of it can still be explained, it seems to me, as just endemic of democratic life, or as necessitated by a progressive theory of history or progressive ideology, since you'd have to be dissatisfied and aspire to more democracy or equality. If you ever were satisfied, that would seem to signal that conservatism would be the most practical position. You'd want to hold on to what you already had. So that, it seems to me, although there's always complexities, takes care of a large amount of the different examples you gave, but that leaves, it seems to me, the Islamic terrorist in the jail. I mean, even it seems, I don't know about the Unabomber, he had his own, that's why it's called the Unabomber, he's a one-man ideology, but even McVeigh, you can still explain a lot of these countercultural figures, American terrorists, anti-federal people, as it's still some kind of bizarre American ideal there. Even I think the KK, the Ku Klux Klan, it's not impossible. But then it seems like Islamic groups that use terrorism, they don't. It's not like the Marxist critique of America where, it's not true democracy. We'll bring you true democracy. They don't. It's not simply you're not really saying what you are. You're hypocritical. It's also saying this is really what you are, and we don't even want to go down that path. We're not interested in modernity. So that seems to me a very different kind of challenge, and it manifests itself sometimes the same way because it's sort of global. But.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's very different also in that it's the most serious and long-lasting of these threats. But the other thing I was going to say is, yes, the determination of to say, oh, my beliefs are not going to be intruded upon by this anymore, that we are obliterating this from existence. Yeah, it doesn't fit in the sense that it reflects some democratic temperament, but I sort of felt that in this case, I didn't mean it to be as literal or as to carry as much weight as this. I mean, I really meant it to be, these men who have such different terrorist ideals all talk about movies together, so that I may be pushing it too far, but that affection for the things and we know that, there are always these accounts of Islamic terrorists who have spent years in the United States and who neighbors will say, oh, he loved going to baseball games. He loved the United States. And all that, and that's not all a mask, because what bin Laden is in his tent in Saudi Arabia, and he's watching John Wayne movies. It's such a bizarre thing. Anyway, I don't want to put too much weight on it. I agree. They're very different.
Could you say though that they're all in show business? That's the commonality. That they really have to know the American marketing strategies are really.
That's interesting. Yeah, they're definitely all did.
ISIS is really high tech now.
Yeah, to get attention and to make some theatrical statement. Yeah.
Tom, did you have?
Well, maybe it's too obvious an answer, but I just want to endorse the theory that I think was suggested, that this is about the decline of religion and something filling the void. I mean, there's less humility than ever. There's more of a need for a reason for being and a cause, and environmentalism, I think, is sort of adopting some of that. Anti-Americanism in the academy is that way. As we're more and more secular, we know more. Well, now maybe we know everything, and only those crazy people in Kansas really believe in religion anymore. So these have all taken, filled this void, I think. I want to thank you for your review. I think you did a review of the Tea Party Museum here, which was wonderful because it is a very commercial and very populist type museum, a very un-Boston-like museum, and you said nice things about it. I didn't expect that in the New York Times. Thank you.
Just a historical note. There was this historian of American immigration, Hansen. I forget all names these days, but very famous. Died young. He was at Harvard for a while, and he was writing more in 1940s, 50s, and it was a time when heritage societies were being created. And that was not so much museums as, an Irish American Association and so on. And his thought has been summarized in the phrase, what the children want to forget, the grandchildren want to remember. Now that was different because they were not, even though they had their own faults, they were not emphasizing discrimination and troubles. There might have been, they weren't emphasizing troubles here, maybe troubles in Ireland or something like that. So, in a way, so this is a different phase that you're describing. And I think it is, I think you have to take it into the race question, or you just have to take that into account. It's all the model of the African American, which of course is different. He's not ethnic and so on. And that model has become attractive, not to the older groups, but it's become attractive to newer groups. It's true the Jews are exceptional in that respect, and I think it's because of the degree of their prosperity or success or something like that. It's an interesting historical note. So maybe this is a phase, to follow the Hansen line, what the children want to forget, the grandchildren want to remember. Because I think the assimilation does progress, and it won't continue. I had one other thought, and that is thinking of very much earlier groups. You didn't refer to anything before the late 19th century. And I was thinking of, for example, Appalachians from, Scotch-Irish and so on, Cajuns and so on. And I think what they become, in time, what they become transformed into is some regional groups. So you would not have you might have a Cajun museum, but you might have even an Appalachian museum or something like that. You wouldn't have I suppose you wouldn't have a English descendants museum. That far we wouldn't go ever. Or they already have their associations, the sons and daughters of the American Revolution and so on. So I just mentioned it's historical phases in what you do about identity. But I think there has been a change, and I think that what you've described, the overall grievance society is certainly there. I think the other point you raised, that was just raised, certainly requires more discussion or understanding this notion of how, despite this, all of popular culture is universally accepted. And with age, and this connection from popular culture, I realize I'm more and more disconnected from American society. I don't know what they're talking about most of the time when they refer to historical periods in terms of bands and so on.
This is maybe
just
I was just say about this, the grandchildren issue about wanting to recover what the first generation lost. There is in Los Angeles, there is an enormous Japanese American museum that has a tremendous number of artifacts. It got enormous support from the local Japanese community and from businesses. So it has tremendous resources and a huge building. The first gallery is really a history of the immigration, with some allusions to what was left behind in Japan. But the whole narrative builds towards or descends to the internment camps of World War II. And that becomes the central sort of object in the central sort of gallery, the conceptual object. Now, I saw this and I just felt like, okay, but these people who created the museum, they were the activists of the 60s and 70s who demanded restitution for, this was the central event of their existence. Is this really the central event in the experience of Japanese American immigration? Yeah. I don't know, but I'm sure that the next generation will not look at it that way.
Yeah.
I don't know, the whole story is going to have to be different.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting.
Yes. Yes. I was wondering a couple of questions. The three terrorists talking in the Colorado prison. Is this did this actually happen, or is this?
Yes. Yeah.
So, and if so, have the transcripts been published?
That would be. If you go to the New York Times and you do a search on these three names, McVeigh, and then I'm sure this article would come up. I think it was from like 1999, 2000, something like that.
Let me go on. So you're suggesting that the American system is not utopian. I wanted to take issue with that, okay, if I might, because you have this. What is it? All human beings are created with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Given the context of the history of work and labor and capital in Europe, and given the existence of slaves and a large contingent of indentured servants in the United States in the years in which the Republic was formed, the idea that everybody should have those rights it seems to me, a utopian notion. And the other, and so I'm interested to know. If you that's a question or a kind of, and you made about three generalizations, sweeping generalizations. Romanticism is not democratic. Modernism is not democratic. All of those generalizations, although compelling, I'm not sure I would agree with them, because unless you were to flesh them out with certainly some illustrations.
We can take it outside.
I don't want to take it outside. I just.
No, you're right. I don't want to take up too much time.
No, I know, but they do. I'm saying, wow, that's really true. Is it?
But it
true?
really
No. But so if you were to make some illustrations, then I could at least understand what you're talking
absolutely.
about.
Everyone would always refer to the early enthusiasms of Wordsworth and Coleridge and their friends for the French Revolution. But if you read what
speaker here.
20 years later, then they are
Yeah.
absolutely conservative in their opinions, in that 19th century conservative sense. And that's pretty much a uniform thing. And even if you look in the next generation after that, you look at someone, I don't know, I mean, as a critic writing about these, I mean, you'll know Baudelaire and Ruskin's writings of the 1840s. These are absolutely in this self-reflexively critical mode.
Mm-hmm.
And both Baudelaire and Ruskin have profound doubts about democracy. As much as they might romanticize the people, they would tend towards imposing an aesthetic view of the world upon their subjects, you know, for their own good. So the idea that we would link, you know, excellence in expression with democracy in practice, I don't think there's much of a historical ground for it. There's an enormous ideal, a sentimental ideal that these things can happen.
But on the other hand, you have something like, I don't know, the Wordsworth's preface to this, in which he declared that poetry was now going to be like a man speaking to other men, as opposed to some divine figure sort of putting forth these.
Yes.
So there is something democratic about mixed in there with all this.
I mean, you know, put it that way. But in the practice of it, I think it's another story.
Catherine has a question.
Mine was related to the non-utopian question, which you didn't get a chance to respond to.
I was going to say something about that. Wait.
Well, okay, I'll add mine on, and then you can respond to both of us. So you had said toward the beginning, in characterizing democracy, that you're judged as more authentic if you're a critic than a kind of advocate of democracy, which I thought was an interesting point, but I wondered whether, I mean, isn't it true that basically the criticisms that are considered authentic are the ones that are based on a democratic principle, equality or freedom, so that really you're not criticizing democracy, but you're criticizing it for not living up to the democratic ideal, which would be a way in which it seems to me to be very utopian, you know, a hope for perfect justice or something. And it also seems like a way in which dissent isn't really encouraged in democracy except along this particular democratic line, but not really, I mean, anything coming from a non-democratic principle isn't considered authentic, but either terrorism or something.
Okay, well, first on the utopian issue, and then I'll go to this other one. On the utopian issue, I mean, I think maybe I still don't think democracy is utopian. I think it may be idealistic in some way. You know, that, I mean, there's no way you could talk about a principle of equality being sort of enshrined in American activities from the very start because of the existence of slavery. However, take the longer perspective on this, and we look at the history of the world, and what is the only example of a society or a civilization that has essentially eliminated slavery? And it would have to be the West in the last 250 years. That I don't think there's any other. I mean, slavery was the rule rather than the exception. So I mean, I agree with you that there was some blindness to. There was a deliberate sort of a overlooking of this major phenomenon.
Schizoid. Schizoid.
Yes, and I mean, to a certain extent, it still exists. But the idea is that okay, so we take a 200-year look at what happened to these, and this relates a little bit to what you were saying. That relates to the statement of the ideal and the actuality, and you do have this sort of extraordinary thing that has really, you know, you could say. Even in Europe, you couldn't say it happened on the same scale, because in Europe, slavery was not an institution to the extent that it was here, where an entire economy worked on the basis of slavery. However, you have this event that took place over 200, maybe you could say from, I don't know, 1800 to 1980, say. I mean, it's an extraordinary period to imagine that in less than 200 years, one of the most fundamental activities of humanity has been sort of demolished in the sense that become unthinkable. I think that's an incredible thing. But that indicates the ideal set by democracy, not its utopian, because the utopian thing would be to say, you know, and the lion's going to lie down with the lamb, and neither shall they learn war anymore. But, you know, that's never going to happen. Everybody's going to learn war forevermore, you know. That's the realistic view. But anyway, but as far as this idea of the the criticism, that I agree with the idea that one of the things that and I was trying to sort of say this, that one of the reasons why dissent becomes a sort of dominant force in democracy is that it's based on the assertions of one's own views of the world and coming into this sort of, I wouldn't say marketplace, but the clamor of competing visions. And that some of these are based on ideals of justice and equality, like the one we were just talking about. However, my point wasn't that every critic who makes these comments is not legitimate, or that this idea is not legitimate, but that the claim of the invocation of justice and equality is being used when it has very little to do with ideals of justice and democracy, that the vocabulary is adopted, but not the meaning. And that to a certain extent, this is true even with the idea of identity becoming the defining characteristic of one's role as a citizen. That we're talking about different ways of looking at the world, but the vocabulary is the same. So that's sort of what I meant.
Yes, Alberto.
Yeah. Regarding the possible explanation of the fact that the terrorists you mentioned at the beginning were interested in Western culture, I remember I read about 10 years ago a book by Ralph Dahrendorf, and in order to explain 9/11, he gave as an explanation precisely the fact that some Muslim who had entered Western society felt rejected, so felt dishonored, as it was said earlier by making a reference to Ajax, or Ajax, how did you pronounce it? And I mean, this is interesting, and this is something which could explain what you found surprising.
It is part of the. I have no doubt there is this. Obviously, it was done because of a sense of grievance, and there are many people who immediately jumped on the idea to say that, well, you know, haven't we caused some of these grievances? But to say something's based on a grievance doesn't mean that this grievance is justified or that the response to the grievance is justified. It's a psychological condition.
Perhaps what explains why extreme actions were taken. So what prompted terrorism, understood in a specific sense?
Yeah, but I guess what's still a problem for me, and I really don't get it, is think about how many people immediately after 9/11 ended up writing about how, you know, the chickens are coming home to roost, in a sense. This is something that, given who we are, we should be aware that we bear some responsibility. When in the past has a nation undergone such an attack, and then immediately a large portion of people say, well, we brought it on ourselves. Even when that's true, even when a nation at war says, okay, we blew it this time, we shouldn't be in this war, this is a big mistake, but they're not saying, oh, okay, let's just put our arms down and like forget it because we really were the causes of this battle. This is what I don't get, and the extent of it, and the way it was, and the way it exists, even on minor things. I mean, sometimes I read things coming out of Europe, and I can't believe that these are Europeans saying these things about Europe. I mean, it's sort of, well, anyway, you know what I'm referring to.
Alex.
So One museum that perhaps slips through your categorization, and this is a rare museum. I don't know of any other like it. It's the Museum of Asian Art in San Francisco, which is close to Chinatown. And it's a museum of very high art, and it has wonderful exhibits of Asian art, both from Asian cultures that established themselves in the U.S., such as China, and ones that didn't, such as Tibet and Indonesia. I don't recall its history, if I ever learned it. I guess I doubt that Asian Americans as such established it. And I mean, my impression is that ethnic groups in the United States don't establish museums of that sort, even though in such museums could be of interest. If Norwegians made museums about Vikings and later Norwegians, or certainly Italians would have a lot to display. Is that because they're deracinated from their old cultures? They're so Americanized that they don't really know their traditional identity, and therefore when they have to express their quote-unquote identity, they can only do so through victimhood, or that's the only way that they establish their otherness. And if the narrative were simply assimilation into American life, then they would be unhyphenated Americans with nothing in particular to express.
Well, I didn't really talk much about art museums because they are different in the sense that they're not. Their concern is not the history of the group. The concern is something about a claim being made for their achievements in art, but the thing. The Asian museums I mentioned that essentially jumble together these nations and traditions that have nothing whatsoever to do with each other and may even have had histories of great hostility, that this is really saying, okay, our identity is based on their shared experience of discrimination or of suffering, of victimhood. So the Asian label is taken as sort of a part of that, as having that weight attached to it. It may be that in the art world that the idea became strong among collectors, and that then this became a genre of collecting that then somehow became institutionalized. I mean, there's a collector in well, this will come back to me. And there are many museums of by Asian collectors of art, collectors of Asian art. I don't really know. I don't know.
I believe that museum is owned by the city. I believe the collection is owned by the city.
Yes.
There.
Well, thanks very much. We have to stop, but this has been quite wonderful.